really interesting CBRS discussion. I think my suggestion to CBRS people is use less acronyms. Maybe then simplify, GAA, certified installer, all of these. If you're not aware of PolicyTracker, we're a newsletter service and also a research service, and we also do training courses. And the one thing we do for free is we do a podcast, so I'd encourage you all to check that out, even if you're not a subscriber. And we've been looking at data traffic consumption trends for a while, because it always comes up in debates about kind of spectrum policy. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about that. I think the first half of my presentation will be less controversial. Second half, maybe more people will disagree with. So the story, sort of as we see it so far, is in 2007, the first iPhone came out. I was 8 years old, so I don't quite remember it, but it had 2G and Wi-Fi. And then what happened then, years after that, sort of 11 years after that, is we saw the app economy grow. And during that period, there was a rapid kind of growth, sort of a year-on-year, and I'll show charts as well to show this, year-on-year change of 50 to 150% annual growth rate. In 2018, something seems to happen where there's a kind of slowdown, and the growth rate seems to drop off significantly. Not to say growth has stopped or growth is slowing, which I do want to emphasize as well. So here's the story from, I couldn't go back to 2007, this is 2012. These are figures from Ericsson, and they're global. And the blue bars are data consumption in exabytes. And then the red line is the annual change in percentage terms. So as you can see there, the percentage change is between 50 to 150 a year. There's a lot of rapid growth. Some years you're seeing a complete doubling of data consumption globally, which is huge. And then from 2018 onwards, the blue chart continues to climb. In broad numbers, the consumption continues to increase, but the red line, which is the annual change, falls off quite a lot. And there's disagreements to as where we are now. This chart ends in 2024. It's a bit difficult to read, but I think it's about 30% was what Ericsson says. Some people say it's a bit lower, some people say it's a bit more. But I would say there's very little disagreement that this is what's happened. So this is in the past, this is established. Of course, some people point out that it's different in different markets, and that is true. Here are some figures from Tefficent, which is looking at gigabytes per SIM card. And you can see some markets are really up there. Finland is at nearly 40 gigabytes, essentially per user. Or I should say per SIM card, because there's a few things contributing to some of these countries. A lot of them, fixed wireless access is quite popular, and that's the case in Finland as well. So 25% of the SIM cards in Finland are data only. Data only SIM carries nearly 3 times more data than a regular SIM. So that's pushing up some of these countries. Finland is also the case in Austria, AT there. Some of the other countries have unique situations. I think Taiwan is interesting because gaming is very popular in Taiwan, and unusually so mobile gaming specifically. So I think 62% of gaming revenues in Taiwan come from the mobile segment. It's very popular, and the mobile operators have catered to that market, and they offer very high data plans, very fast speeds. All this to say, each country can be very different. When we talk about global trends, that doesn't mean that applies to every country. And I think these outliers are important to consider. Some countries where growth is a lot bigger. Baseline is a lot bigger as well. If we group some of those countries into regions, however, a trend of slowing growth becomes obvious again. So this is from Analysis Mason. It's looking at different regions and the percentage year-on-year traffic growth. So if you group all those countries together, you see that there's a sort of similar trend. There's a downwards trend in the growth rate. It varies a lot on the regions. Some regions, the teal color line there is sub-Saharan Africa, which is currently still experiencing around 60% annual growth rates. But it's worth saying that their starting point is much lower. So they use about a third of the data that's consumed in the Western Europe region. So I think it would be fair to make the assumption there's a bit of catch-up happening at the moment still in some of these markets. And some of them obviously remain quite high. Sub-Saharan Africa is the highest at 60%. And I don't know why they chose these groupings are not the easiest to understand, but that green line is the MENA region, which is also seeing a lot of growth. Why has this happened? There's this idea that we've reached sort of peak smartphone. Most people sort of have reached the equilibrium of the amount of video they consume, and video is a good analogy for data traffic because it's often the biggest driver. People sort of watch enough cat videos and those habits become entrenched. And I think if you think about it on a personal level, you probably consume a similar amount of video today as you did 5 years ago. The resolution is increasing, but it's making less of a difference now. A lot of things are HD, and there's less of an incentive to go higher than that because you're looking at quite a small screen. And I think developers are also incentivized to try to use less data and try to improve their compression algorithms because that's in their interest as well, to save money on data centers and work towards their green targets. So that was maybe the less controversial part of the slides, and the more controversial part is the future. It's difficult to tell what's going to happen in the future, but I think they matter a lot to spectrum decisions. This is our perspective. So I've looked at a few different predictions for the future. These are all for 2028. We've got Ericsson here, which predicts that in 2028 we're going to use about 3,200 exabytes in a year. They've recently downgraded their prediction. That's the old one. I'll talk about that in a second. We've got Omdia, which is actually for 2027, unfortunately, but they predict 3,300. And Analysys Mason predicts 2,700. And then Ofcom's number is a bit interesting. They laid out 3 scenarios, a low, medium, and high growth scenario, which are percentage terms, but I've calculated them into that. Ofcom's is interesting, actually, because their lowest scenario is pretty much on par with the highest estimates from the other sources. And I think they did that report in 2022. I think if they did today, based on what I heard Christina saying in recent years, they would have maybe come to different conclusions on their scenarios. But there's a lot of disagreement. Sort of Analysys Mason's the least optimistic ones. Ericsson and Omdia and Ofcom a bit more optimistic, Ofcom especially. So there's a lot of disagreement. I do want to talk about Ericsson's prediction because they changed it recently. We did a story, my colleague Merva did a story on this. Basically, they dropped the numbers for 2023 and they dropped the numbers for, I think, 2022 as well. But they made a point of saying, look, our prediction in terms of percentage, it's not changed that much. It's a lower starting point. Some people said this is odd. There's a quote from William Webb here. It says, bizarrely, the new forecast jumps back to the old with a 10% increase in growth and a near precise track of the prior forecast. It is interesting if you downgrade your figures for 2023 and 2022, why the assumption is that the rate of growth will continue exactly as it was before you made that downgrade. I think that's worth pointing out. So this is their change. The red line is the old report and the green line is the new report. You can see there the bump down. So it's 2022, 23, and 24 that saw the biggest change. It looks like a relatively small change on this chart. I think it's more useful to look at it like this. So these are the numbers in exabytes per year. Again, with the red being the old report and green being the new report. And you can see if you extrapolate it to 2028, that's a nearly 20% drop for their prediction of how much data we're going to be using in 2028. So I think it's actually quite significant to do to downgrade that prediction. I should say the reason for downgrading it. They said they got more data. That's as much as they told us, unfortunately. They also said other analysts have also downgraded their predictions, but they wouldn't tell us who those analysts were. So it was a bit unsatisfying, I think, the answer we got from them about their change in prediction. I think you can look at data consumption and then you can look at use cases, and they're obviously related. But I think those are the two biggest arguments that are used when it comes to spectrum debates. And if we talk about use cases, I think it's worth reflecting on some of the 5G use cases that maybe didn't come to fruition or haven't come to fruition just yet. There's the infamous triangle there on the right, the 5G triangle. And a lot of those use cases on there are just haven't happened. I mean, augmented reality, the VR market is growing relatively, but it doesn't use 5G. Connected cars, self-driving cars, also in a very immature phase and not necessarily relying on 5G. As a lot of the computing happens sort of on the car. So I think as a cynic would say, look, 5G use case failed to deliver. Now as we start hearing about 6G use cases, maybe we should have some doubt about that as well. I should have put a picture on the new 6G hexagon. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It gets a lot more abstract. It doesn't name kind of specific use cases, and it's more about sort of connecting the virtual world. It's all very abstract. I think that's for a reason. Maybe the ITUs figured out that predicting specific technologies is probably not that easy to do. 62% of user time is spent on Wi-Fi. I think we all know that. This is something you point out as a critic. I skip over this slide, but having more spectrum does equal more capacity, but constant increases in efficiency also help capacity. And there's various other things you can do too. Obviously, network densification, there's various other things you can do. And I think we do ourselves a disfavor when we sort of dumb it down to we need more spectrum because we have more demand. Those two things aren't linked that clearly. There is a link, but it's not the only sort of aspect. There's a chart here from the CTIA. Speaking of acronyms, the orange line is CMRS spectrum, which is licensed spectrum in the US, and then the blue line is the amount of traffic handled by each megahertz. And they point out there's been a 42% increase in spectrum efficiency in that time. Obviously, it ends in 2018. But operators are becoming very good at delivering over content over the spectrum that they have, and they're increasing their rates they can handle at a much faster rate than they're receiving spectrum. I think for policymakers, this is.
If I may, on the exact graph, I think it's not quite appropriate to account all of that traffic increase on spectrum efficiency increases, because you would also need to consider the number of sites. I guess those are the three main drivers: the amount of megahertz, the amount of sites, then what you can do per site with the amount of megahertz.
They said, that's what they said. They said 42% increase in efficiency, but I understand what you mean. There's different ways to increase efficiency. So this part will be more controversial. So if you have any issues, please raise them.
Unfortunately, there's physics. Efficiency can't be, spectrum efficiency can't be arbitrarily increased.
Yeah. You do hit a ceiling eventually. For spectrum policymakers, I think all of this could mean a sort of adjustment. In the past, the goal of spectrum policy was often make sure that mobile operators have enough spectrum, and that's a completely fair goal, and they definitely needed a lot more spectrum. If that changes, and there's a disagreement about whether it will, there will need to be some kind of change on the policy side as well. I think it could mean the end of sort of big, splashy, expensive auctions, but it could also be an opportunity to invest more in innovative sharing solutions, which I spent a long time talking about CBRS. On the other hand, I think taking what I said today about data traffic growth and concluding that mobile operators do not need any more spectrum going forward is very short-sighted. I don't think anyone's doing that, to be fair. But we shouldn't read too much into these trends to say, okay, that's it. No more auctions and no more spectrum. You've had enough. I don't think that should be the takeaway. 6 gigahertz, my favorite topic. This is just to say, everything I spoke about mobile data traffic today. The trends are actually similar in the fixed network. So there's a chart here from the GSMA showing percentage change. The blue line is the fixed traffic network. The red line is the mobile traffic network, and they're both on the decline. And I think that's really worth pointing out, because when you talk about 6 gigahertz, you've got two industries who are interested in it, the Wi-Fi people and the mobile people. their interest is both based mostly in future demand, and their use cases are actually quite similar when they talk about use cases. So I think the same conundrum is sort of true for the fixed users. And it's definitely something you should take into account, because 6 gigahertz would be a capacity band for the Wi-Fi industry. But do you suddenly need another 500 megahertz of spectrum if your needs are actually going down, if your growth is going down, if your growth is slowing down? So I think 6 gigahertz is a great example of like where data traffic figures are making the argument more complicated, or making the situation for regulators a lot more difficult. And I think in the future, there's going to be a lot more 6 gigahertzes. And I think the European model is saying, let's do some kind of hybrid sharing. Could be a good compromise to not knowing exactly who needs it. So we'll see how that goes in Europe. But I think that what Europe is doing is a reaction to this graph. It's a reaction to there's no explosive growth for either of these industries. We need to consider how they can both use the band. All right. So I've done that really quickly, so I'm only running 10 minutes late of schedule. But just to conclude, data traffic is trending downwards year on year. Data usage in gigabytes is still growing significantly, but the era of exponential growth is over for now. And then talking about the future, the predictions on the 6G era differ widely, and it's unclear from our perspective if 6G will need new big swaths of spectrum. And I think the industry and regulators need to adapt to this new reality as we come closer to it. That's it. Quick time for questions.
Thank you, Richard.
That's
Of course.
I had a feeling.
Hey. Thank you, Richard, for that presentation. A couple of comments and a question to you. In terms of year-on-year percentage growth, I mean, even if data is increasing linearly, the percentage year-on-year growth will reduce, and that's just pure mathematics. So I think it would be good to be, a bit more cautious about how we interpret year-on-year percentage growths. And frankly, from your charts, you could see that percentage growth were leveling down to 20%. I mean, that 20% is huge, frankly. I mean, that
your
means
bank account is huge, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, if the amount of traffic on our roads increased 20% a year, that'd be a nightmare. We'd consider that a nightmare in terms of accommodating. So I would say let's not underestimate what 20% growth means in practice.
And it is exponential. So even shrinking data traffic with 5% per year would be exponential.
Yes. So that's again pure maths. Exponential means that you have a to the x, and that means a percentage increase. But maybe that's a point of detail. Well, my question to you: how is this relevant to spectrum needs? Because the volume of data growth is one thing, but actually the spectrum need is linked to the data rates at peak hour. So you can have total volumes increasing or even decreasing, but what matters in terms of spectrum needs is during the busy hours, how much data rate is needed to support the people who need the connectivity. So I'm not sure actually volumes of data traffic are relevant to spectrum needs. What's relevant to spectrum needs is the data rates. That's my view, and we can talk about it later as well on the panel, but I was wondering what you thought. Is total volume in a country a correct metric for spectrum needs?
Maybe not. I think I would say that's what the industry has been saying. They've been saying 100%, 200%, this is why we need more spectrum. So they've been making that link. I'm deflecting your question. Ask the mobile industry. Ask yourself.
Well, to be frank, we always said, the link is whenever we do spectrum needs, we look at the data rates because that's the clear linkage. So if anyone's arguing along those lines, I mean, there is an indirect link. Of course, you can argue that if there's increasing volumes, maybe if it's the same number of people, then they must be using higher data rates. But that linkage is not direct.
It's a fair point.
Yeah, maybe also very generic comment on, well, we try to retrofit some exponential growth into a series of data in the past, and then we extrapolate that into the future. There is no law of physics behind that data growth. And it depends very much on what can be offered affordably, from my point of view. And maybe one could really dig into a country, see when the 5G introduction had reached a certain point, both in terms of the networks and the terminals, and you could see certain jumps for that year or so, or for a group of years. So to me, there are really these three factors that we can build more capacity. It's adding megahertzes, it's adding sites, and it's adding spectral efficiency. And the big problem is adding sites. Hypothetically, that's a great option, densifying the networks, but it comes at huge cost. Not only in terms of money, it's hard to find those sites in a city like London, almost impossible probably. And then you would also increase the ecological footprint in terms of more concrete, more steel, more air condition at the site whatsoever. So it comes at a huge cost. So the easier way out, and basically the way to provide at pretty much constant operator revenue, but meaning pretty constant monthly bills to the consumers, more data every year, is to increase the capacity and the performance per site. And that goes in terms of spectral efficiency, mainly in higher bands, more antenna elements that fit into the same form factor. But they also need to fit into these form factors or a smartphone form factor to get those efficiencies. But certainly it's mainly more megahertz. And Moore's law allows to process more megahertz, more antennas over time at constant cost, constant energy consumption. So that is somehow the logic. And as long as we can provide spectrum and more computational power as mobile industry, I think one can live on that, well, pretty healthy revenue stream of mobile operators with a certain share in put in modernization and upgrades of the networks. If we stop that spectrum supply, then the whole thing breaks at some point, and then we will have no growth in data in a very simplistic model. If there is a way to provide that affordably, then we'll constantly see growth, because I think everyone could use more video on their phones, going to work. Well, there had been changes in behavior in Taiwan reported. People preloading content to the phones, watching that on commute to work. When they discovered, wow, 5G works great now on the commuter train, they didn't do that anymore. We can debate if that is of huge social value, but I think that's how it happens. So whatever is offered affordably will be consumed, and then we look backwards at the results. What does it mean in terms of data rate, and try to fit a % per year growth.
You're saying spectrum is the cheapest way to add capacity?
Yeah, maybe the only affordable way to provide that capacity.
Uli, just to add, forget about the debate of, whether you need additional spectrum or not. But, let's say we agree with you, correct? Additional spectrum is maybe the best way. Do you think that sharing is now more, like the MNOs would be more open to sharing compared to years ago, or is it still going to be clearing?
I think sharing is interesting because sharing lowers the power level, right? Sort of distinctively, and therefore it becomes less.
Sina was talking also about localized, like some of the CP applications.
Well, like in LSA, we did not really talk about lowering power levels. I guess there are sharing schemes. If it's, for instance, time-wise, if you have good prediction when and where you can use. Well, you always need to justify investment, and that goes into the lowest hanging fruit. If you get an exclusive band, even if you spend quite some money in the auction, that's quite predictable. But then you're sure you can use that 100% of the time in that location where you want to deploy. If you now reduce the percentage of time, there's a certain threshold when this is no longer attractive. But if it is, let's say, some defense spectrum used in training grounds where you don't need the capacity of an MNO anyway, the soldiers want to watch Netflix.
I guess my question was more, do the MNOs, are they now more open to that? Because I can tell you, you know, I mean,
Well,
AT&T 's
Verizon.
yeah, Verizon.
apparently-
There was a reason why, because
Yeah,
they didn't have any
Exactly,
option.
exactly.
If the C-band auction happened before CBRS, I don't know if CBRS would have been successful.
Yeah,
They spent
yeah,
$81 billion.
as I said, lowest hanging
Then-
fruit.
Yeah, exactly. So no, but that's fine. I don't think we need to answer. I'm just saying, and this is, you know, workshop about sharing. And I can tell you that every time you talk about, you know, CTI, every time it's like, you know, clear that it's harder. We're going to hear about from the satellite guys. You know,
Yeah.
you have broadcasters. You have it's getting harder and harder.
We
I
have
think
the
there
6
need to be
gigahertz discussion.
yeah, exactly. There need
whatever
to be a
bands, yeah.
change. I think there need to be a change in mindset also. I think we need to be more open towards, you know, towards sharing. It cannot be just
Yeah, I
get
think
everyone
that
out.
that
And,
is happening.
okay.
And maybe some of the attempts in the past maybe explain that something more attractive had been offered than in the process,
Maybe you should have.
and that deferred the interest.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, no, just one thing, you mix something up in the data, and maybe you can elaborate around that. That was the thing with fixed wireless access, because there are two different types of spectrum which are there. If we take on board also the data which is delivered by fixed wireless access, then we may speak about different spectrum as well. Maybe in the US, 28 gigahertz, for example. In Europe, also some other bands as well. Of course, you can use the mobile spectrum as well, but then from the regulatory perspective and the growth perspective on that one, I won't discuss the growth figures itself. The mathematical point has been pointed out before, but that could have a significant impact, because if you then have to take on board how much spectrum is available also for fixed wireless access compared to mobile, pure mobile, that is something different. And then we need to take on board the capacity which is available in that direction as well.
I take your point. My understanding from this graph was this is fixed wireless access which use the same bands. Okay. Because it's based on SIM cards.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I take your point. There's fixed wireless access data that happens separately. I think it's easiest to sort of exclude it from the discussion, but the numbers are lumped together, and that's why they have to be.
And just to be clear, and maybe my colleagues are here as well, is there a line where it is no longer economically feasible to provide anything from the spectrum side? We are now speaking about 6 gigahertz. We put forward 26, but it hasn't been put up right now. Everybody is waiting for the economical peak, I would say, when it turns to be economically feasible to use that. But up to now, obviously, we are not there yet. So if we say 10 gigahertz is really the breaking point, then there is not much left in the pocket, I would say. Or we are speaking about really making drastically changes in the usage of spectrum, which will have other consequences.
I don't know. Clearly, mid-wave wasn't.
But if
economic.
we consider location or time where the spectrum is not used, white spaces, you have many white spaces across from 0 to 10, right?
Yeah.
I think what we are saying is the people that we assign spectrum to, there is less and less space, right? But it's not physically, it's not true. There are spectrum which are available, not used, but we don't have the tools to use it. You came yesterday with your white space with the military.
Yeah.
I mean, TV is congested then, right? But you are still coming in 2024 with a new idea of let's make white spaces available for military. So when you want, you can, right?
The point on that one is then really economic feasibility and availability and quality of service. And if we are discussing one band, we are only discussing then those figures for this one band. If we discuss this for the whole service with all bands, it's a totally different scenario. I'm with you on that one. We are not maybe very innovative in that direction, and there is room for innovation. Exactly on that point. I agree with you on that. But I haven't said that our way of doing spectrum management is very innovative, but it provides also the security and the security for the investment of the companies who are asking for it. And TV whitespace is exactly the figure which pointed out to be in Europe with LSA the same thing. The companies in Europe were not willing to accept a certain level of uncertainty on the spectrum side in order to provide a service.
But you know what? At the beginning of CBRS, nobody agreed. It has to be a call made by policymakers, and sometimes you have to take risks. You don't have only to listen the biggest mouths, right? I mean,
Maybe,
But then you can't-
can you go to your slide with the
Looking at you.
spectrum in
Okay, you are clearly looking at you, so.
You had the overview with 2018, the spectrum available and the data.
All right.
Anyway, that's good. So
That one. At 2018, we had more than 1,200 megahertz of spectrum available in Europe. That's that's 1.5 times the spectrum available in the US. So is that good? Is that bad? Have you done a more efficient job? Certainly, because in C-band, you have only 150 megahertz and we have 400.
for the mobile industry, it was good.
Yeah, for the mobile industry, it was good, but now we are discussing
Now I
the same
say the
things.
counter-example. The counter-example is private or local licensing. In Europe, we still not have a band. In Germany, you have a band, 3.7, 3.8, that IMT will get back, because we have maybe 6 years after the US, we have 3.8, 4.2, but you don't have the equivalent of CBRS band in Europe.
Yeah, but
don't.
CBRS is not a service, it's a tool.
No, I mean, the local licensing, we show it's very healthy. I mean, people benefit from it, and it's not the big names, usual big name. What I'm saying is your example saying that the IMT was better off in 2018 than in the US. Yes, but what about the other industries? I mean, we should stop talking about IMT or even Wi-Fi. I mean, there are other industries that require spectrum, which have economic viable business case, but it seems not to be
But
not to be the top
3.8, 4.2 is being harmonized in Europe.
6 years after the
Yeah, but
US.
better late than never, but also,
Yes,
you know, there are other industries, but your very excellent presentation, by the way, congratulations. But you did demonstrate that for CBRS even, the primary use case is fixed wireless access.
not the primary, half of it.
I think 70% or something, right?
No, it was.
I'll have to look at your slides again. But so there are lots of other industries that need spectrum. It looks like they need more time. So regulators need to balance, you know, the different industries and their usage. I'm sure these verticals, I mean, 3.8, 4.2 in the UK was initially targeting small industries, verticals. But when you look at the licensees in the UK, they're primarily, again, fixed wireless access. So it looks like verticals, there's a room for them, but they haven't, it's not there yet.
But it's not harmonized.
Yes, but
You don't build something for UK only. So the game changer
Right.
will be 3.8, 4.2 because
exactly.
it's harmonized among Europe.
Yeah.
This is what CBRS was for an industry which is not IMT, but which is using 3GPP technology or FWA. So
So what's the argument?
my argument was that you say in 2018 that Europe was much better off with spectrum than US.
No, I just.
And I'm saying, but it was only for IMT. Yes, so IMT win in Europe in 2018. True. But I think this is not anymore the case. You have to
Any other keynotes or?
But you know, we don't.
We definitely have a cup of coffee and discuss more about that. There's
A panel and.
Well, I did discuss with Prakash. I said, you know, if people are going to be falling asleep on Friday, so I'm very glad